Hello, my name is Jamie Sparling. Welcome to the FormABLE Podcast. And today I am interviewing Guro Jeff Westfall. If you remember from a previous episode, Michael Harrell from our Martial Arts Academy had recommended Guro Jeff. Guro Jeff was part of a formative and formable moment, and we just wanted to reach out and say hello. And yesterday I was able to talk with Guro Jeff for quite some time, and he's always been so knowledgeable. He's been part of formable moments for me as an instructor in the Inosanto organization, going to seminars. Guro Jeff Westfall has not he has hosted Guro Dan Inosanto numerous times. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Guro Jeff Westfall. Guro Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing okay, all things considered. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Yeah. Thank you for all of your patience earlier, as
No
well
worries.
as patience in general. Like, I remember being very early in instructorship and following you around like a puppy, and you were always so helpful, and I just really appreciate knowing you and having that kind of, at the risk of saying whatever, a guiding light in a lot of ways in the Midwest for what we do, because there's
No,
not.
that's very kind of you.
You're very welcome, sir, but there's not a tremendous amount of schools that do what we do. So that was always, I think,
Yeah, it immediately creates a link where you can, you don't have to explain things that you have in common about how you feel about Guru Dan or how you feel
mhm.
about meeting all these other cool instructors. And there's so many different points of connection that I get it
Yeah, it's a beautiful
very much.
thing. It's a beautiful thing. Uh, One of the formable moments for me actually happened at your school. And it was when Guro Inosanto had put up these different configurations of the Y, and he put up a triangle, and he said, "Right now, what I'm going to give you is going to be a diamond. You might not be able to understand what that is right now, but I want you to remember that, because a diamond to a child looks like a piece of broken glass, and they'll throw it in the trash. But it's actually a diamond. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about right now, keep playing with it, and you will." And that was a moment where, quite honestly, I didn't get it. It took me a long time to like understand the diamond of what he's talking about, and that was such a neat thing for me. And I remember you were standing right over in the corner at that moment taking notes.
Yeah, I do that a lot.
Yes, you do. Guru Jeff, could you tell us a little bit about your martial arts journey?
Sure. Um, this is my 53rd year in the martial arts, and it began when I was 13 in 1971 when I I grew up in a very violent, abusive household,
Mm-hmm.
and I was basically like a scared pup, like a pup that had been kicked around all its life. And I was fascinated by the martial arts, but in my mind, I had no talent for anything athletic. I had put myself in a box mentally that
Mm.
this is cool stuff, and I love watching it. I'll never do it because I'm not good enough, but I love it. So I had a buddy who his brother was a green belt in Kyokushin karate,
Okay.
which is people ask, is that Okinawan? Is that Japanese? Kyokushin is it was created by a student of a Japanese man, which is Gichin Funakoshi.
Okay.
Um, and that Japanese man learned his karate from Okinawans. And then the founder of Kyokushin lived in Japan, but he was part of the underclass of people of Korean descent that were basically kind of like Latin American people are here in the United States. They accepted money to do really crappy jobs, and so he was of Korean ancestry, but he took a Japanese name. His name was Masoyama,
Mm-hmm.
and um, so when people ask me, is it an Okinawan style? Well, it's a style practice created by a Korean based on an Okinawan style that he learned from a Japanese guy.
Well,
Call it what you want.
yeah, that's
And
fascinating. So many arts are like that, really, because there's more to it with the layers, you know.
there's always nuance and subtlety, and a lot of people don't want to sit still for that. But
Hmm.
since we're kindred spirits, I figure I can lay in some detail. But
Appreciate
anyway,
that.
so he was a green belt in Kyokushin, and he was my best friend's older brother.
What year
And
is
he
this
practiced
now?
in his back. I'm sorry,
What year is this now?
1971.
1971. Thank you.
And he was his my best friend's older brother. We were comic book nerds. My buddy and I, we
Hmm.
got on our bikes every Saturday and rode around town and went to all the used bookstores and bought comic books and talked literature and music and comic books and but his older brother was this badass 5'5" bodybuilder who practiced Kyokushin. And I just wanted to watch, and he wouldn't let me watch. I said, John, why can't I watch you? He goes, you're welcome to come out and train with me. He says, but you can't sit there and do nothing.
Hmm.
Um, and I said, but that's a waste of time. I was always the guy that when I would show up for a pickup basketball game in the playground or a pickup football or baseball game, I was the guy that fist fights started over who had to take me on their team.
Me too.
I was so bad at anything athletic, but I loved it. I liked being around it. I liked doing it, but I also, it was humiliating to have that happen. But so
Hmm.
I kind of put myself in this mind box that, I'll never be good. I just like to play. And so I told John, I go, I can't be a good sparring partner for you. I'm never going to be any good. He goes, I don't care. If you want to watch it, you have to watch it while you're doing it. So I grudgingly agreed because I thought it was so cool and it was right here in town. I wanted to, and free because I could just go
Yeah,
work out with him. He wasn't a
accessible.
formal teacher. He just didn't want me not participating if I was going to be there. So that went on for about 2 years. I'd just go over there and I'd hang out with my buddy. And then if John was home, I'd go out in the backyard and train with him. Occasionally his brother and my buddy would train too, but he wasn't quite bent in that direction as much. And I remember at first I was kind of like the comedy relief character of the 4 or 5 or 6 guys that worked out in the backyard. I was like the mascot. And I was fine in that role because I was accepted. And then one day, the number of guys in this group, it grew slightly. It got smaller as time went on. And I remember there was one period after about 2 years where for a couple of weeks, it was just John and I, just the guy
Hmm.
that was the green belt. And we were talking about techniques. And I threw a side kick while I was describing. I said, I like the side kick because of this. And I threw like this side kick at about hip level, and his eyes got big and he goes, Jeff. I said, what? He said, your side kick's better than mine.
Hmm.
And I said, don't do that. Don't say that. Don't blow smoke up my butt. I don't need you to do that. He
Hmm.
goes, I'm not. He goes, your side kick is better than mine. And it took him a lot of convincing, and when that moment happened, it was one of the first formable moments in my life
Oh.
because all of a sudden I realized I had gotten better through practice and I didn't think that was possible.
Hmm.
So the gloves were off. That was the beginning. I mean, after 2 years, that was the beginning.
Hmm.
And then no one could stop me. You can put chains on me. I'm not gonna not practice, And I was already obsessed with Bruce Lee and had been since I was 9 because he was my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He was my Power Rangers.
Yeah.
When I was 9, he was Kato on the Green Hornet.
Hmm.
And you'd have to have lived at that time to truly appreciate how awful the level of martial arts as depicted on film and in television was in those days. I mean, it was rancid. It was terrible. 50% of it was, chopping someone on the side of the neck in a spy
Hmm.
movie or TV series. And we all, the origin of that?
No.
That got started because it was a good way for a stunt man. He could kind of round his shoulders and tense up his traps and tense up his neck, and he would let the star chop him on the trapezius muscle. And then he would drop
Oh.
like a sack of potatoes. It was a safe way to do it. It was not technically accurate for anything resembling a real technique.
I always
But
wondered where
some,
that
some,
came from, Guru.
yeah, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
So anyway, that was what you saw, and you took it for you saw that, and you go, oh, well, I guess karate people can do that.
Hmm.
Just like Spock can, grab your neck and make you go unconscious. It's
Like
the same
martial
thing.
mystery, right?
Yes, yes. So anyway, and then so that's the background. That's the awfulness of martial arts. Kicks were terrible. No one was kicking correctly. It was probably a stunt man that didn't know what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, with that background, I see Bruce Lee as Kato throwing just gorgeous martial arts techniques, and I can tell the difference.
Yes, that
I,
makes
I don't
sense.
know anything about martial arts. I'm only 9 years old, but any kid can see I like that animation better than I like that animation.
Mm-hmm.
He was so dynamic. And that was when I saw that and I said, that's what I want to do with my life. But I was still young enough I was still under that cloud that I'll never do it. I'd like to do that with my life, but I don't think I ever will. And so that day with John, when he said that, that was fantastic. And then 3 years later, I was in a Kyokushin club where I went to university and got my black belt there.
Yeah.
So that was my first art. And then I started teaching friends sort of informally in 1976.
Mm-hmm.
And I was teaching like a couple guys on my dorm floor at Indiana University. When I'd come home for breaks, I had friends that lived in Evansville, and I'd show them what I'd learned recently. I started really and early on becoming interested in other things. I used to drive my Kyokushin teacher crazy because I was the asshole that said, "But Bruce Lee says," and I
Yeah.
didn't know any better. I didn't know I was being rude. I
There's
was
still a lot of
powerfully
those
curious
assholes
about the
out there,
martial arts.
sir.
What's that?
I'm sorry. Oh, I could not help it. There's still so many of those assholes out there right now, sir. You know what I mean?
Yeah, oh yeah. And I've had to
God
deal with
bless
him
you.
as an
You
instructor for
didn't
years
know.
and years.
Yeah, God bless you. You didn't know any better at that time.
I just wanted to know something. I was obsessed by this point with martial arts knowledge. And in my mind, it didn't occur to me that I was affecting the instructor's ego by asking him questions. I was too green to
Yeah.
even understand that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very naive. I wasn't trying to be rude. It was just like, how come we don't kick below the waist? And you go,
Okay.
well,
Yep.
that's dirty fighting. And I heard that the indoctrination that I heard all my career, which was, if you can kick a man in the head, it's easy to kick him in the knee. You don't need to practice kicking at the legs to be good at kicking at the legs, and you save each other's legs for your future. And I always thought that was
Wow.
bogus logic because you're kicking at each other's skulls, you're
Yeah.
kicking at each other's ribs.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that safe, but kicking at the legs isn't? But back in the 70s, man, if you kick below the waist, you were Cobra Kai, which was
Oh,
my
so
school and my
Greg.
market had a bad reputation because starting in the 70s, I was teaching people to kick to the knee.
Mm-hmm.
I did a podcast episode about it entitled "The Redheaded Stepchild of Kicking," referring to kicking low back in the 60s and 70s.
That's the Martial Brain, right? That is
Correct. That's
that's
my
your
podcast, The
podcast.
Martial
Yeah.
Brain.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So anyway, as I got a call from a buddy of mine back in Evansville who had also done some karate, and he was also an old nerd buddy of mine from grade school.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a call from him, and he said, "Hey," and he was a martial artist. He said, "I can get you and I a job teaching martial arts for the summer. And I'm in my first year of college. I'm on a free ride. I have a full academic scholarship."
Nothing better.
And he said, "But you can't get this job if you don't quit school early, because you need to be here before you graduate." Or not graduate, it's my freshman year.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so depressed and unhappy at college.
Mm-hmm.
I was getting decent grades, but first time away from home, which is weird because you'd think I'd be happy to be away from my home. But all my reference points, I had no reference points. I didn't know how to live in this environment. I was in a very dark place. And when he said, "You got to quit," I said, "I'll be there." I walked around the next day and got withdrawal Fs from all my professors, completely alienated myself from my mom, and came back down to Evansville, and I taught martial arts for the summer with him. And I lived with my mom. She didn't like it. She was always on me to get a job. And I started, we donated some free lessons, or we donated blocks of lessons to a public television fundraising auction. And he remodeled his mom's garage, and we taught our first paying students in 1976 in that garage. And I I lost you there. There we are.
Oh, there we are.
Um, and that was he and I. It was the first time we went into owning a location together or renting a location together. And he taught his students there, and I taught mine there. And it was just a remodeled garage, so we just alternated times in it. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, I wasn't happy with my level of knowledge for teaching. I mean, I was happy to teach what I knew, but I really wanted more for myself. I was, being a black belt was not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I realized. I can remember being told, well, a black belt's just the beginning. And I remember thinking, yeah, whatever, black belts are hard to get. And they actually were in Kyokushin in those days. This was before, the 2-year mall karate school black belt.
Commercial martial arts.
Yeah, commercial martial arts was not as big a thing in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
It was growing. Taekwondo had hit in the late 60s, and that was really blowing up the market.
Mm-hmm.
All my training partners weren't Kyokushin guys, even though that was my background. All my training partners were guys who were black belts from local Taekwondo schools. They'd come over, and because I had my students kick low, and because I kicked low, they wanted to experiment with it, but they'd get demoted at their school if it was found out they were coming over and working out with me. So I started developing clandestine relationships with other black belts early on because I was doing stuff that a lot of people thought was crazy, and they heard about it,
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, as the years went by, I became obsessed with Wing Chun.
Mm-hmm.
and spend a little time with a guy that was a local hairdresser who Chinese from Hong Kong, an immigrant who also was a badass at Wing Chun. And he didn't teach very well. I mean, man, when he did the forms, it was his style of Wing Chun went fast when they did Silim Tao. And it was hard for me to follow, and his English wasn't good, but I was obsessed with it.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't do Chi Sao with him because he just beat me up, and he couldn't teach me how to, but it was interesting. I was fascinated by it, but he wasn't a great teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Nice fella. He just didn't have a clue as to how to teach.
Yeah.
And anyway, that was becoming interesting to me. And then I started hanging out with a couple guys that were amateur boxers.
Okay.
And it was so funny. I got into a ring with one of them, and my specialty in those days in Kyokushin wasn't kicking. Later on, I became a kicking specialist. But at this period, I consider myself a hand specialist, basically because my kicking sucked. And Kyokushin doesn't demand, in my opinion, the same level of virtuosity in kicking as does, say, Taekwondo or Savate.
Okay.
So my kicks really weren't that useful yet. They were okay,
mm-hmm.
but my reverse punch and my back fist and the classic, the lunge punch, I could do those really well in Kyokushin style sparring. So I thought I was good. I could break 5 boards with my reverse punch. I had my black belt. I had done well in tournament competition. Mm-hmm. I got in the ring with this guy, and he just handed me my ass. I mean,
yep.
he didn't hurt me. He had good control, which was another thing. I had been indoctrinated to believe that boxers don't have control and karate people do.
Ah, that would make sense at that time, though. I mean, for that.
Because we were taught that our punches were lethal.
Uh-huh.
And that if we connected with them, we'd kill people.
Yes.
And so with us, control was not an option. You must have control.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked upon boxers, we were taught to look upon boxers as being wild, uncontrolled brawlers and not seeing any science in what they're doing.
Mm.
And it was really funny because this guy he just tore me apart, and I was a hand specialist. And then he stopped and he goes, well, gosh, he goes, I'm not that good a boxer.
Really? Oh.
And then I said, well, can I kick?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, sure. And I was amazed to discover that I could handle him if I could kick, even though I didn't think of myself as a kicking specialist. He was totally untrained in kicking, and all of a sudden I could handle him.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got more and more into boxing. I got more and more into Wing Chun, adding it to my Kyokushin. And always in the background was the articles that I had read in the martial arts magazines when I was 13 and 12 by Bruce Lee. He used to have like an article every other month, sort of preaching the doctrine of Jeet Kune Do. So anyway, that continued. I got into other things. There was a fellow who was a postal inspector, like a federal cop, who moved to town for a little while to work at the post office. And he was of Filipino ancestry, and he practiced Eskrima. And he'd heard that I taught sort of a point sparring style of martial arts, point fighting style with low kicks added in.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, I want to spar. He goes, my uncle taught me eskrima up to a point, but I'm terrible at kicking. I'm terrible at punching. So we traded lessons for about 6 months, and that was my first introduction to eskrima.
Yeah.
It wasn't much, but he gave me my foundation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I taught like this through the late 70s into the 80s. Starting in 1980, I got my first commercial location. It was just a room at an athletic club, you know, but I built my business. And in 1984, I saved up $200 to go to the California Martial Arts Academy camps in St. Louis to do my first training with Guru Dan Inosanto.
Yeah.
And that takes me a little bit to a negative formable moment, if you will, in my career. And that is, this wasn't the first seminar I went to.
Mm-hmm.
I had already brought a world champion heavyweight kickboxer, whom I will not name, to my academy to teach a seminar. He's passed away now. And I had always admired his approach to fighting when I read articles about him. I admired his intellect about it, but he was just an awful person. And I didn't know this until I brought him in to teach this seminar.
Mm-hmm.
And he was rude, obnoxious, arrogant, good, and a good heavyweight. And when the seminar was over, he said, "Gear up. I want to spar with you so your students can watch." And he broke my nose and beat me bloody.
Oh.
And he just kept yelling. The way I sparred was more of a point style at the time. I had not transitioned yet into a competent kickboxer.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way I fought, my hands were down and I did a lot of movement and evasion, and it worked on most people. It didn't work on this guy. Mm-hmm. And so he kept hitting me and going, "Get your damn hands up." And he would yell at my face and tell me to get my hands up, and just blood's all over my face. And I was, very upset, but I wasn't showing it. I was not going to let this guy get my goat. So I took my beating, and then it was over. And I resolved, okay, I've got to learn how to do this better. And I started hanging out more with a couple of boxers. And a buddy of mine who was an old black belt sparring partner, I said, "You've always expressed an interest in what we called in those days full contact. Let's buy some gear and let's spar, Mm-hmm. And so I just started building it up from the ground up. And then I started training with a guy who had 100 wins and 5 losses as a boxer. This guy is named Kevin Young, and he's one of my very oldest friends. And he beat me up for a year and taught me how to kick, and I beat him up for a year and taught me how to punch, and I beat him up for a year and taught him how to kick. And then my kickboxing game really grew significantly. So I brought this same jerk back to do another seminar at my academy. I knew I wasn't going to beat him. That's not my point. I just wanted to show him better than the last time, right? And so the seminar went better, and the first seminar, we went out to dinner afterwards, and he was terrible to the wait staff. He was terrible to the cook. A cook came out and asked him for his autograph, and he said, "Well, maybe if you get on your knees." And he was joking, but not very well.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was just he was clueless socially. He was so arrogant. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so I brought him back for another seminar. It went okay. I learned things for sure. And then he sparred with me, and he didn't beat me up as bad. I definitely did better. Mm-hmm. And to his credit, he stopped and he looks down, he points his finger at me. He goes, "Compliment, much better than last time." And that was it. And I never brought him back again. I just had to get that out of my system, Yeah. So that was kind of a formable negative moment. It was like, okay, if I ever become that dangerous, I'm not going to be that person.
Yes, absolutely. I've heard old school stories of things like that happening during seminars, especially at the very, very beginning part of like the seminars.
Back in the old days?
The seminar era. And back in the old days, for sure. But at the same time, like right now, there's seminars for everything. Back at that time period, it was just kind of starting to become one of
especially in the Midwest.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
If you lived on the West Coast, like when Guru Dan started doing some of his camps and seminars almost all of them were either in a major East Coast city or a West Coast city or Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And over time that changed. But anyway, so when I decided to go to my first camp with Guru Dan, or my first seminar with him, I was nervous because I'd already had this interaction with a world famous guy. I was obsessed with Bruce Lee. I wanted to train under Dan Inosanto.
Yep.
I had no idea whether he was a good person or not, or what he was like, but I was steeling myself for him to not be a nice person, which is ironic when you think about
yourself, right?
Yeah, I was bracing myself for it. And then I got there, and not only was the level of technique that he and his assistant, Cass Magda, demonstrated, but it was that the technique was transcendent, but he was such a nice person too.
Yes.
I can remember standing in line to ask him a question the very first day. We'd only been training for an hour and a half or so. And then so it was a water break. And immediately whenever there's a break, people gravitate over towards Guru Dan and start asking him things, ask him to sign things. You know the drill. And so he's always so sweet when that happens and patient. And I was actually waiting to ask him a tactical and technical question because I was fleshing out my notes. That's what I did during all the water breaks, all the lunch breaks. Everybody else wanted to socialize. I wanted to work on my notes. And I got to being the second person in line when the guy in front of me asked him, excuse me, Master Inosanto. And Guru stops him and he goes, please don't call me master. He goes, I'm not a master. Just call me Sifu or Guru. Yeah, I know. And that really impressed me, and then as time went on, I just saw examples again and again and again of what a sweetheart he is, what a nice person he is. And that was a very formidable period for me that first week, because I felt like not only had I found a source of information, I'd actually found a martial arts home,
Absolutely.
And that was very nice. Yeah. So anyway, it goes on from there. I was back the next week to take the California Martial Arts Academy camp, this 40-hour camp. And this time, even though Guru was back that week teaching another group of people, I took the Bill Superfoot Wallace camp.
Okay, yeah.
And I was obsessed with Bill Wallace. By this point, I'd been thinking of myself as a kicking practitioner for a while. Some of my Taekwondo buddies back about 1976, 77 started saying, man, Jeff, you have good timing and you move well, but your sidekick is for shit. And that's interesting after
just messing with you,
what my Kyokushin, brother had said to me was, your sidekick's better than mine. And I thought of my sidekick as being good, but it was a Japanese style sidekick. They don't put their hip into it. And so, my Taekwondo buddies go, come on now. And I'd go, how do you kick so damn hard? And they go, you have to put your hip into it. So they showed me how to turn my hip. And I started becoming obsessed with that. I was sloppy as heck. I would watch them, and I basically developed a good full hip Taekwondo sidekick from training with my buddies. And then that led to the first time. You have to keep in mind that televised kickboxing in those days was in its infancy. The PKA was the first organizing body in the United States, and it was founded in 74. So it's only a year or two old by this point. They weren't even using ropes in the early days of the PKA. They had just a square that was a different color on a big mat than the rest of it.
Yeah.
And, and they just kickboxed. They didn't even wear boxing gloves. They wore those old point fighting dipped foam hand gear. And fought for the knockout in the very earliest days.
Is that where those came from? Those dipped foam? Yeah,
that's where they were first made. They weren't used for point. If I might be wrong, I don't think they were used much for point fighting until after PKA made them very. They started selling them in droves because people saw Bill Wallace wearing them and Joe Louis wearing them, and Blinky Rodriguez and Benny Urquidez. Those were like among the very first champions. And anyway, so American kickboxing was not very advanced at this point, and the kicking wasn't great except for Bill Wallace. He was clearly a cut above when you watched him fight and you saw how he kicked. And at the time I wondered who taught him, but now we know that he mostly developed that system himself.
Yeah.
by imitating pieces of other guys' games and just being a tremendous talent. So I was obsessed with the way he kicked. Your chance to watch him fight was when it came on Saturday mornings, ABC Wide World of Sports.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah. I
they would
remember that.
occasionally have boxing or kickboxing, but there was no streaming. It wasn't cable. This was just network TV. And so your chance to see anything worth emulating on TV was rare. And I remember a particular angle watching Bill Wallace fight. They had the camera at that moment behind him so that you're looking at the back of his head, and he threw his hook kick. And I was always fascinated by his hook kick, and I couldn't figure it out. But from that angle, I saw that he threw a side kick that missed off to the left, and then he hooked it through. And all of a sudden, it was like a moment of enlightenment. And I started practicing it, and I thought I got it down pretty well. And then, of course, his round kick was all of his style is based off of an inapparent chambering position where your chamber doesn't give away which of 6 kicks you're going to throw.
Yes, sir.
And I understood that, but I wasn't very good at it yet. I was approaching it. So I went to this camp with Bill Wallace, and he was very complimentary once. And that was when he chose me to be one of the 2 people to help him run the seminar, to be his uke. Okay. That was the last compliment he paid me. And then it was like nothing was good enough. And my ego had gotten big enough by that point that it hurt my little feelings, when he would critique my technique, because I was used to being the instructor and the big guy in the room, and he just tore me down. And I can remember after the week was over, I had a lot of fun with him too. He's a fun guy, but man, he was not fun when he was coaching me. And I can remember being in front of the mirror back at my academy when I got back, training drills that he taught me. And I'm just pissed off, and I'm just kicking and doing the drill. And I stopped in mid kick and I went, oh, he knew he was going to piss me off, and he knew I would do this. I said, he's a good coach. He read me right. He read, it was exactly the right level of, kicking me in the butt to help me get better at his system. And I got much better at his system after these drills that he gave me. And that kind of became my identity around the tri-state area here, was my kicking skill and my flexibility.
Yeah.
But then that helped keep students coming in. But as time went on, I started getting better and more knowledgeable because I started following Guro Inosanto everywhere he went in Junfan, Kung Fu, and or Jeet Kune Do concepts, if you will, instead. He wasn't teaching Muay Thai in 1984 at his seminars. He was teaching Junfan Kung Fu, FMA. He called it Kali then. A little Silat. He had just been given permission by Paul Detours to show a little Silat.
Yeah. Yes,
and that's how far back in time this was. And he wasn't training, or he wasn't allowed to teach anything that he was learning from Herman Sawandi yet. So there was very little Silat. And as the years went by, he started adding in Silat. He started adding in shoot wrestling. And so my first exposure to how to do a Jujigatame and how to do a Kimura and so on, or what they called it was an Udigatame, was through Guru Dan at seminars.
Yes.
So, which is interesting because I wasn't doing anything like rolling. I didn't know how to roll. I didn't know how to use all these locks I was learning, except I would get frequently called up to the front of the group and say, Jeff, show them lock flow number 1, which has 30 locks in it. And I worked hard and bought the book and I'd memorized it, And so Guro Inosanto would call me up to demonstrate that. So let's tuck that knowledge away for future reference, right?
Yeah.
So shoot wrestling was a big part of what we did. So I followed Guro around for years and years and years. And probably around the time I got my instructorship under Guru Dan, I'm bypassing Muay Thai. Let's go back in time to when I was taking the week with Bill Wallace in 1984.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a policy of the California Martial Arts Academy group when they did these camps, and that policy was there are 3 simultaneous camps going on, each one in a different room at Washington University in St. Louis. And it goes from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. with a break for lunch. But on Thursday at 2:30, you're going to switch instructors. We're going to do musical chairs with your instructors. You're going to be with an instructor that you didn't pay to come see, but shut up and take his lessons anyway. And So the first week when that happened, it was Stephen Hayes, the ninjutsu guy.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so for 2.5 hours, I learned gun disarms and hanbo techniques from Stephen Hayes. And he was actually a refreshingly wonderful instructor.
That's what I heard.
I was at the time, I was a little put off by well, you're too young. The ninja craze in the 80s was just irritating to serious martial artists. And I shouldn't be judgmental because I now have students who are very far advanced in ninjutsu, training with Stephen Hayes, and they say such good things about him. And then the day I met him, but at the time it was like I rolled my eyes, and Cass Magda said, "Hey guys," because there was a lot of grumbling that we were going to have to leave Guru Dan's seminar and go take lessons with a guy we didn't want to. And Guru goes, "Okay, guys, I want you to listen to Cass." And so his assistant Cass is sitting over here on a table at the edge of the room, and he's looking down, he's kicking his feet, and he says like he's reciting. He goes, "Keep your eyes open and your ears open and your mouth shut, and you just might learn something." And Guru Dan goes, "What he said." And and so he was not only giving us permission, he was commanding us to go learn from this guy. And that was cool. That was interesting. And then the next day, I think they did this on Thursday and Friday, because the next day I trained with Paul Vunak for 2.5 hours.
What was that like?
Paul Vunak is a very intense man. I later came to find out that might have been a little chemically supplemented. But to train with him when he was young and fit, before he kind of ran his body down, was impressive. His knowledge level, I later grew to realize, he doesn't teach anything beyond like a super, super basic level, because it's all just street fighting stuff.
Yes.
He doesn't really raise much of what he does to like his jujitsu was just combat jujitsu. His Muay Thai was just limited to kicking the thigh, as far as I could tell. His Savat was limited to a side kick to the knee. Everything was just street fight specific. And he was really good at it. Some of his students weren't so good at it, but he was very impressive. And I remember learning some Dumog from him, and some in close empty hand stuff that was very impressive that I liked a lot. Then the next week during the Bill Wallace seminar, when one of the two breaks happened, all three groups were pulled into a gymnasium, and Guru Dan was officiating. And so we've got, I don't know, there must be 100 people in there. And he pulls out 2 pairs of Thai pads. I didn't know what Thai pads were in 1984.
Sure.
I might have seen pictures of them in magazine articles, but they were rare as hen's teeth in the United States in 1984. And as a matter of fact, the Thai pads that he had were made by a company that started making them here just for Master Chai's students, for Ajahn Chai's students, because he was already generating a little bit of a market. And in the 80s, importing Thai pads from Thailand doubled the price of them.
I'm sure.
And so that's why the Perma-Built company started making these blocky Thai pads that were really popular then. They were made for Master Chai. So anyway, Guru Dan pulls out 2 pairs of these Perma-Built red Thai pads, and he has Cass Magda hold the pads, put on a pair of Thai pads, and he has Larry Hartzell, who's also there teaching his own seminar, to put on a pair of Thai pads. And then he says, "I need 2 volunteers." And I actually already told this story on someone else's podcast. Do you know who Dwight Woods is?
I sure do. Yeah, he's the JKT.
Yeah, he has yes, and he has a YouTube show or cast that he does, and he interviewed me on his show. Well, anyway, this was the day I met him, because when Guru Dan asked for 2 volunteers, all the guys in my Bill Wallace seminar stuck their hands on a lot of them put their hands on my back and started shoving me forward. And I'm like, no, I don't want to volunteer. And they shoved me out there. And then I look over and there's this African-American dude with like big, long dreadlocks, looks really fit.
Yeah.
And he's the other volunteer, right? And so it's Dwight. but I didn't meet him. I just saw that this other guy is going to be the other victim in this demonstration. And Guru Dan says, I want you guys to see, and I want these two guys to experience what it feels like to train on Thai pads. And so he said, the rules are very simple. He goes, I just want you to keep round kicking. Because you probably call it roundhouse kicking. He goes, I want you to keep round kicking on these pads. Just keep kicking. Don't stop. Right leg, left leg, any pattern you want until 3 minutes are up. Right. And I already kind of did stuff that was a little bit like this with kicking shields with my buddies, but it was mostly, we would do 30 kicks or 50 kicks. We didn't set a timer. But I was kind of used to this to a degree. And so I said, okay. And Dwight said, okay. And we got ready. And Larry Hartzell held for Dwight, and Cass Magda held for me.
Oh, that's awesome.
And what's that?
That's awesome. Those are like legends right there.
Yeah, I'm dropping names, right?
Yeah, well, they're legends.
And this was my first time to meet either one of them, right? So that was interesting too. Well, okay, I'd met Cass the week before. But anyway, so I just start kicking the pads hard, right? And everybody's yelling, go, go, everybody's rooting for you. And I'm kicking the pads, and I'd never done it like this, where like the kicking shield, the air shield, was so unwieldy. You didn't do a lot of sparring type stuff with it as much as you just, at least with me, we just repped it out. But Cass is throwing kicks at my legs. He's not hurting me or anything. He's just kind of going, watch your stance, keep your balance, defend your legs. And then every time I'd get done dealing with something like that, he'd put the pads up. He'd go, kick, don't wait. Boom. And I kept kicking. So I'm kicking and I'm kicking. And I remember thinking, good God, I'm going to get tired way earlier than I thought I was. Probably between the adrenaline of being in front of all these people and never having actually done this particular form of training before, not this way. And I remember thinking that, and in the middle of me thinking that, Guru Dan shouts, 38 seconds have elapsed.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And I can remember thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not going to make it. But I knuckled down and I kept going. I was dogging it. I was tired. I kept kicking. And I'm going to say this not to make fun of Dwight, because I left this detail out when I told this story on his show. And I did mention, I said, I saw that you were the other guy, because this is the first time we talked to each other. We didn't really even talk to each other then. So we're actually making each other's acquaintance after both having this pivotal experience 35 years before. So it was really neat and you can find it online and watch it. But anyway, I noticed out of the side of my eye that he was lying on his back, right? So he hadn't got knocked out. He was just tired like me, And I didn't pay much attention because Cass was going to kick me in the leg, but I remember seeing it out of the corner of my eye. And then so finally I finished, and I sat down and I grinned like an idiot at my buddies, and they were all going, yeah, because I made it. And I was embarrassed by how tired I got. I was really embarrassed by how tired I got.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Because, I was not at the standard level of a guy who's passed Master Chai's test yet. Right. From the perspective of that guy, it was jokingly easy. But that was a level of kicking Thai pads. I'd never kicked Thai pads. So, and I'd never trained exactly like that. I'd kicked heavy bags, and I was in decent shape, but I think the adrenaline was definitely part of it. Everybody's yelling at me and I'm going like it's my first fight, So anyway, Guru Dan walks up to me. I stand up and I make the Y and salute him. And I said, thank you for letting me try that. And he goes, no. And he grabs me and he pulls me aside and like almost conspiratorially, he goes, you weren't supposed to make it 3 minutes. And,
really?
And I said, I said, he goes, you're really talented. And I said, well, that's really nice of you. I don't feel very talented right now. And he goes, how many fights have you had? And I hadn't had any, but I sparred with badass boxers and kickboxers fairly frequently.
Yeah.
And we did mostly sparring. We really didn't like doing the training. We just wanted to spar. We were young martial artists and we just wanted to spar. We wanted to play, not work, which is what I call it now. But when I tell my students, I go, I went through a play phase too, but you got to train, you got to work out. So anyway, after he asked me how many fights I'd had and told me I had talent, I had to sit on the floor and wait 2 hours for my head to come back down to get small enough to fit through the door so I could go back to my dorm room. It blew my head up when Dan Inosanto complimented me. But that was an interesting experience. And then so I was telling Dwight about it, but I didn't mention the part about seeing him on the ground. I left that out of politeness.
For sure.
And he goes, you saw though that I didn't finish, right? And I said, what do you mean? He goes, I didn't finish. And I go, well, yeah, I remember seeing you on the ground, but I didn't want to mention. He goes, no, it's okay. He goes, I was, I made it most of the way. It was only like 15 seconds left. And he said, I thought I did a pretty good job, and I said, you did. I know how hard that was. And making that far was really difficult. So it was really strange for us to have this interaction after 35 years and talk about something we both went through. And it was his first introduction to Muay Thai. And now he's an instructor under Ajahn Chai. Yep. And it was my first introduction to Muay Thai. And now I'm a senior instructor under Ajahn Chai. And I don't know, that was an interesting experience. And then to talk about it was an interesting experience. But that was the beginning of my Muay Thai career. And the last thing that day that Guro said to me was, you really should seek out Master Chai. You need to be training with him right now. And so I did, and he had his own seminar circuit. And so it was 2 years before I saw Ajahn Chai. I met him in 1986 at the Great Smoky Mountains Martial Arts Camp. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
That's completely legendary. One of my
yes, as it should be.
Yeah, one of my teachers, Guru Steve Bristow, and
was he from Wisconsin?
He's from Springfield, Illinois, but he's the guy who started with me. But him and one of his students, Greg Holcomb, had went to this thing, and they would talk about it at our group, and it didn't seem like, it was just like natural. And then one day we were with David Rawlings in St. Louis.
Yeah, I know David Rawlings very well.
He's a great guy. And literally, Greg was like, yeah, well, I went to that camp, and Guru David was like, you went to that, like, legendary, the Great Smoky Mountains Camp, as is really the California Martial Arts Academy, because that was the very beginning of people taking it on the road, so that it could be.
I remember Guro taught an earlier California Martial Arts Academy group of seminars in Colorado. I remember seeing it advertised in Black Belt magazine and thinking, I'll never have enough money to go to something like that, because it was too far to travel. The traveling was what made it so expensive. And then when I saw the advertisement for the St. Louis one, that's a 3-hour drive from my home city, and that's what made it doable for me. And I borrowed the $200 to go. And so anyway, interestingly, Dave Rawlings, I met him at another seminar in St. Louis, a Guru Dan seminar, probably, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years later. And he and his buddy, what's Joe's last name? I'm embarrassed. I can't remember.
Yes.
He and his buddy Joe were like 17 years old. Joe Craig. I'm embarrassed because Joe's my buddy, but I'm getting old and I lose names.
From that area, you guys all were the ones that brought it, so that, like, my generation.
Yeah, they were bringing Guru to St. Louis for a while. Yes.
Yeah.
But at this point, there were 17-year-old kids, and their teacher, Jim Smothers from Arkansas, was bringing in Guru to St. Louis, and they followed me around like puppy dogs all throughout the seminar. Can you show me how you do the double Pak Sao? Can you show me how to do this, Mr. Westfall? And I'd only been an instructor a few years.
Just like I did.
Yeah, they were cute. I mean, that's the word I would use. They were good, very gifted, right? Sure. But they were just fresh-faced young instructors, and it was just neat to see. But that's the beginning of my knowing Dave Rawlings and Joe Craig. Anyway, so I started a parallel course of following Ajahn Chai all over the Midwest, and at the same time I was following Guru Dan all over the Midwest as often as I could. And then Herman Sawanda, Edgar Sulite, whoever it was that was coming within 5 hours of driving near me, Eric Paulson.
Amazing, yes.
Now my status is not current, because Sensei Eric quit doing seminars within 7 hours of here. And so I became a representative under him, which is like 2 levels above coach. I don't remember all the levels, but that was the beginning of my complete MMA training. That was under him. But I was following him around, and it got to the point where I'd have to drop somebody to pick someone up to train under.
I understand that.
Yeah, you've been there too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And remember when I talked about Guro was very complimentary to me about how I did joint locking when I would demonstrate the lock flows.
Mm-hmm.
And the highest level of it I ever did was when I demonstrate the lock flows. I didn't use it. If one of my students and I were sparring at my academy and we lost our balance and fell down and he tried to get on top of me, I would generally end up okay, but I didn't know how to get to my submissions from that context.
Mm-hmm.
And it was embarrassing. So this goes on through 1993. I'm running a martial arts academy. I'm training with all the people I can possibly train with and fit it in. Sparring all the time. We have open sparring. I make a tradition at my academy. Everybody from everywhere in driving range is welcome free of charge to come to my academy for 2 hours every Saturday. Sign a waiver if you haven't signed a waiver before, and we're just all going to spar. And it's going to be a friendly atmosphere, and no one's going to hit you up to start training here. No one's going to try to do that. All we need is friendly bodies to play with.
Mm-hmm.
And we kicked below the waist, which was a big draw. And so that was a thing going on at my academy all the time. That was my laboratory,
the lab,
along with sparring in classes as well. But the first UFC happened, 1993. Mm-hmm. Now, at this point, I've been running an academy since 1980. So I've been teaching and owning a commercial academy for 13 years. And the first, go ahead.
I actually started about a little under a year before the first UFC doing
you're right on the other side of the threshold in commercial martial arts in the last 50 years, because that is the biggest breaking point in martial arts in America over the last 50 years.
Absolutely.
And I can remember before the first UFC reading articles about the Gracies. I mean, the internet in those days for martial artists was Black Belt, Karate Illustrated, Inside Kung Fu, and their offshoots.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I haunted the newsstands every month waiting for the latest episode issue. But the newest news that you got was more than a month old, because it was a magazine. But, the magazines were full of stuff that was just put in there because they needed something to fill it this month. And so let's get Sifu Douglas Wong to tell us why his approach is really smart. Or let's get this guy to tell us, and there'd be an article about his approach. Mm-hmm. And of course, everybody claims that they have got the right idea and the right mix of whatever, whether traditional training or iconoclastic, non-traditional training, whatever it was. Naturally, if someone's in an article, they're stating their case. So you read this all the time, and you're not sure who to believe, or because some of this stuff is contradictory. And you would see articles about the Gracies, and them talking about how effective that their system of jiu-jitsu is. And then you started hearing about their $100,000 challenge, which was the precursor to the UFC, which was they had a backer that put $100,000 in escrow for them. At this point, they're teaching in garages. They don't even have an academy yet.
Michael Morrow got to train in the garage with Hickson. He told us about it a little bit. So yeah,
that's where Eric Paulson got all of his jiu-jitsu, was 5 years of private lessons with Hickson. And at the same time, training in shoot wrestling with Yori Nakamura at the Inosanto Academy. Mm-hmm. So that Hickson's garage saw a lot of miles.
The beginning generation.
Yes. And of course, for those who don't know, who are watching this, Hickson, of the 5 sons that were jiu-jitsu players, I think there was one or two sons that were like black sheeps because they didn't do jiu-jitsu, but of his 5 most famous sons, Hickson was the family champion. He was by far the best insofar as who beat whom rolling.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting why Hoist was selected, because Hoist told me, I got my blue belt from Hoist at a seminar.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me, I said that I had rolled with Hickson before. When it was over, we rolled like at the Hoist seminar. First time I met him, and there were 200 people there, and this is like 1994. So he's riding the wave of the UFC, and so 200 people are coming to his seminars. Mm-hmm. And I didn't go there to get a blue belt. I'd been training for about a year, but he walked around and he watched everybody train, and he watched everybody working on the techniques, and then he watched everybody roll, and he walked around and took names from a few people. And when the seminar was over, he called me up, and along with 5 other guys, and gave us blue belts.
Oh, that's old school. Yes, sir.
It was cool, but it was also interesting. I wasn't sure I deserved it, but it certainly was, an interesting experience. I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to back up and say that
I'm pulling you off
after the
track.
after the first UFC, that confirmed my suspicions that the Gracies were actually onto something.
Yeah.
And
yes, sir.
Obviously, that was a pretty damned effective demonstration, which is what Horian was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
That, this isn't even the best of the brothers, but we don't care because any one of us can handle all comers in this situation. Now, that I don't believe that was true to an absolute degree, but it was still a damned impressive demonstration, especially in the tournament format, where the champion had to fight 3 fights in one night. And Hoist is this scrawny looking dude that comes out wearing a gi, and everybody else is wearing different stuff. And he just looked like he just stood out like an orphan, and he beat everybody. It's very impressive. And so not long after that, Hickson did a seminar in Cincinnati, Ohio. And he actually had a blue belt in Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. And Cincinnati is 3 hours in the opposite direction of my hometown from St. Louis. I'm smack between the two of them. And so I wasn't teaching a jiu-jitsu class yet, but I had about 5 or 6 students that since the UFC were playing with me. I bought Renzo Gracie's 11-volume VHS cassette series, and just absorbed that. Mm-hmm. But I did all that after going to this Hickson seminar. And now, okay, let's put a pin in that and in my shoot wrestling experience. And I'm going to back up again to when I had just started teaching commercially, like it's 1977, 78. I went down a rabbit hole at that time of becoming obsessed with ground fighting. Mm-hmm. Not jiu-jitsu, but ground fighting like Harimau.
Okay. The Tiger system is Sumatra.
Kicking on the ground. I didn't know what Harimau was. Mm-hmm. I knew what, this is asking me if I want to leave. Should I just tap this? Okay, we're good. I knew, of course, what ground fighting was, because a guy named Paulie Zink, who practiced monkey kung fu, was in the kung fu magazines regularly, and he did everything he did on the ground, or transitioning from standing to the ground and back up. And it was monkey style, and I thought it was fascinating, and I was really flexible, and it looked like something I might be able to do. So I would just look at the pictures, and I remember there was a book on Penjok Silat that was advertised in Black Belt, and it was the only information on Silat by Don Drager. And I paid for my copy 6 months in advance. So I remember that's where I saw what Harimau was. There was a picture, there was a little chapter about Harimau and a few pictures of guys on the ground. Mm-hmm. And I instantly started taking up the poses they were in and just playing with my students. I was already teaching students. I was obsessed with, how do these guys fight on the ground? How do they fight in the mud? Mm-hmm. And I made up a lot of stuff, but it worked pretty well. My students did not want to spar with me on the ground. They go, nope, get up. I'm not doing that with you. I don't know what to do with you. I can't do anything with you when you get on the ground. Mm-hmm. So I started developing a certain rude level of competence with it, not knowing that what I was developing was my jiu-jitsu open guard. Because, wherever my opponent would go, I'd turn on my butt and I'd point my feet at him. Mm-hmm. I'd be sitting like in seated guard, but that's because I'm baiting him with my head. I wanted him to kick at my head so I could lie back and kick him in the groin or kick him in the leg.
Yes.
And I based it all off of like Jun Fan and side kicking and oblique kicking, the cross stomp.
Yeah.
From the ground, that's Harimau. That's called Tuklao in Harimau. Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't know that, but I was already doing that because I liked the oblique kick standing up. So I developed some fairly effective stuff. And, that fell in the background when I started doing Muay Thai and other stuff. I was like, okay, that's just stuff I made up. It was fun and it was good exercise, but now I'm learning some real shit, Mm-hmm. But then when I went to the Hickson seminar, in a weekend, he took me from someone who had no confidence in their ability to connect up his grappling skills on the ground to each other, because my knowledge was all isolated islands I knew the island of Jujigatame. If I could get your arm between my legs and get you in position, I had a good chance of finishing you. I was really good at sitting facing a partner, and we each have an ankle lock. Right? I give him my ankle, and he puts it in his armpit. He gives me mine. Guru Dan used to have us do this at seminars. It was called a gunfight, and he says go, and you both crank down on the footlock and see who taps first. And I won those frequently, so I was pretty good at that, like little tiny pieces of rolling. But I had no idea how to get from a Jujigatame to a footlock. I had no idea how to escape from underneath a good mount. And in one weekend, Hickson Gracie was able to show me how to connect all my islands with little sidewalks, with little, like, I don't know, bridges.
Yeah.
And I went back to my academy. I bought a mat over the weekend, and I got my students on the mat and just started wiping them out because I knew how to do the submissions pretty darn well, relatively speaking, not against smart resistance, but I'd never experienced that. But just, sitting here and, how we do when we do jiu-jitsu, we sit, we face each other, and we slap hands and bump fists and go. When I started doing that, man, it was like a quantum leap. And I now realized that I was building a game I didn't know I was building when I was doing all this ground fighting. I was getting good at moving on my butt and on my back, spinning, using my feet to hook and to push and to kick and to grab, and then grabbing people's legs and pulling them in and just doing crazy stuff. That's all stuff that I now teach in jiu-jitsu, but I didn't know it. I wasn't like, I'm not trying to claim to be some kind of idiot savant. I was just a talented kid kickboxer who loved sitting on the ground and messing with my students in that weird context and seeing what I could do. And then it was really interesting how in one weekend I was able to connect a lot of dots. That's when I truly got hooked on jiu-jitsu, just over that weekend. And then it was a few months later, not months, it was about a year and a half later that I went to that first hoist seminar. Because Hickson came back one more time within driving range of me, and it was a good 3 or 4 years later. But so anyway, that was the beginning of my jiu-jitsu. That was an interesting formable moment right there, because it was unlike so many other parts of my growth, it was a moment, it was a weekend long, and it was extremely pivotal. In those days, to train with a blue belt, we would drive 3-4 hours and pay a lot of money to take private lessons from a blue belt.
I bet.
It's so funny. And that's not too long before I met Mike Harrell. I moved from that commercial location to another one. And I met Mike Harrell probably about 1986, I'm thinking, something like that. No, was it? Yeah. So I met Mike Harrell before yes. Because as a matter of fact, he used to come over to Scott Sullivan's house, Bam Bam, or that's actually Scott's dad's house. We would all go over there and we'd watch the UFC because he would pay for the pay-per-view. So I actually met Mike well before I started training in jiu-jitsu. And I remember that he was a fine wrestler. He was a leg riding specialist, and had a good banana split. He showed me some wrestling stuff that was it was over my head, but I still remember. And was a good student and was a really good kickboxer, which was fascinating because he had one foot that didn't work right.
Yeah, he didn't talk about that when he came in. He really talked about as much as you really you were a part of a formable moment with him. But yeah, I mean he's such a hard worker. He absolutely fascinates me as a human. He's always working on something, and
he's a perfectionist.
Yes.
That's what I admired about him. As soon as he came in and took his first lesson from me, I saw it right away.
Did you?
He was curious, which I like. I like a critically thinking mind, a scientific mind. And he was intense, and he was a hard worker, very intelligent, highly intelligent.
Yeah, most definitely. He actually talked about overhearing you talking about a game that you developed at a party and hearing a couple words. And at that time period, like you were saying earlier, if you had an opportunity to even talk about it with somebody that just knew what that was, you had to jump right in there because that was a very small group of people,
Yes. As a matter of fact, I I was in the 70s. In the late 70s, I met the woman who's now my wife, and moved in with her. And I was at a party of her friends, so I didn't know anybody. This is early on when we were just starting to date. And so I go to the party, and it's fine. It's not a bad time. I just don't know anyone. And so I'm kind of migrating around, and you know how the clumps of, here's a conversation clump in this room and a conversation clump in this room.
That's all you can catch.
Yep. And so I walk into a room, and here's a fellow sitting there. Now, I put this in one of my podcasts, so you might have heard this before, but he's holding forth about something in a very authoritative way. And he didn't deserve to be authoritative. He was just talking like, I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then I grew to realize he was talking about the martial arts. So he struck me as being a bit of a jackass. So instead of immediately jumping in and raising questions and so on, I just sat and listened. And he was so full of shit. And it was interesting because at a certain point I started feeding him questions. Well, how about this? And finally he goes, after about the fourth one, he goes, you need to quit asking me all these damn questions. He goes, I know what I'm talking about. He goes, I train with Jeff Westfall.
Oh,
and at that moment, I remember thinking, what a unique opportunity. This jackass just claimed that he's my student to me, and he doesn't know who I am. I must use this only for good.
Good to keep balance in the force. I hear you.
I've got to keep balance in the force. I can't use this for evil. So I said, wow. I said, I've heard he's an asshole about Jeff Westfall. And he goes, no, he's really cool. And he says, and he's a good fighter. He said, you should hear the story about how he cleared out a bar here in town one time, a biker bar. And I said, really? And he says, yeah. I said, that's fascinating. And so I reached in my pocket and I pulled out my driver's license and I handed it to him. I said, read that name there. And he read it and his eyes got really big and he looked at me, he goes, wow, you have the same name as my teacher. And then I reached in my pocket and I pulled out a business card for Rising Phoenix Martial Arts Academy. And I handed it to him. And he started sputtering and I'm drinking too much. He got out of there, ran to the bathroom, and I didn't see him again. Sure. But I picked up a student from it because one guy that was at the party was impressed by the fact that I didn't get in his face and challenge him. Right? That I did it subtly.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was that subtle at the time. I thought it was funny, but it was a fun thing to do at a party. But I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't trying to pick up a student. But the guy thought that was interesting that I didn't go, oh, yeah, well, motherfucker, I'm Jeff Westfall,
Yes.
And
yes.
that never occurred to me.
Yeah,
I hope so. Be that as it may, that was, I picked up a student there. But so when you referred to conversations about martial arts drawing you in, that is one that always comes to my mind.
I bet.
So anyway, and then that story leads to the present through lots of instructors and lots of different systems. I still teach jujitsu. I no longer teach a separate siloed Muay Thai class, Junfan Gung Fu class, Majapa Hit class, and combat submission wrestling class. For years, I carried a crazy schedule. There more often than not, if I was there for a night class session, I was teaching both a Muay Thai class and a jiu-jitsu class side by side and simultaneously. And so I'd go over to the Muay Thai guys and I'd give them an assignment. Maybe it's on Thai pads, maybe it's a sparring drill. I'd watch them get started, make sure they seemed to be doing okay, and then I'd walk over to the jiu-jitsu guys and I'd do it with them. And I would just go back and forth. And I'm not bragging because I didn't trust anybody else to teach, and I didn't have a budget to pay anybody else. So I just took all this on myself, and I did that for more than a couple of decades. For more than 2 decades, like let's say 25 years or so, until COVID. And then I split all of that stuff up that wasn't jujitsu. I combined it all into, interestingly enough, a course with the same name as what you have at your school, integrated martial arts.
Yes, sir.
because I didn't want to have it associated with any one culture or any one instructor. I didn't want to feel like I had to worry about my status in some organization as an instructor anymore. I didn't want to worry about teaching a technique from Art A during the class that is technically assigned to Art B and getting in trouble for it, or having word spread through the grapevine that I was not teaching legitimate X or A or B or whatever. And I just finally reached a point where I just had ran out of patience for that. And so when I teach my integrated martial arts class, I have a lot of young guys walk in, by the way, that say integrated martial arts. Oh, great. I want to take it. They go, you're an instructor in Muay Thai, and you do boxing too. And I go, yeah. And they go, great. And I go, you probably think it's MMA. And they say, yeah. And I go, I'm perfectly capable of coaching MMA and teaching it. And I've worked the corner of a number of guys, as their coach. But integrated martial arts is not MMA because it has MMA within it. I teach ground and pound. I teach, takedowns and submissions, mostly in the jiu-jitsu class, but not ground and pound. We don't do that in the jiu-jitsu class. So there's an overlap there. But I said, I also am just as likely when you walk in for a class in integrated martial arts, I'm just as likely to hand you a practice knife or a stick or a staff or a rubber gun as I am anything else, and they go, well, I don't want to do that. I go, I thought you might not. I want to make sure you understand that it's not MMA that you're getting into. And a lot of young guys don't want to do my integrated martial arts class. But you understand. But I put fencing in it because I fenced for more than a couple of decades. I got my fencing teacher to start teaching at my academy. He had never taught before that. He just terrorized the competitive circuit in the Midwest through the late 70s into the 90s. And he was in my role-playing game group, Dungeons and Dragons group. And he had taken Kung Fu from the same guy that I first, we taught in his mom's garage 3 iterations later in a commercial location. And I knew he was a fencer, but I could never get him to show me anything. And as the years went by and I kept bothering him about it, he finally agreed to come teach me fencing at my academy. And after 2 years of me doing that, it's like, you should really teach a full class and actually teach other people. And so I kind of was his unofficial assistant instructor for the next 20 years. And I did fencing with him. And fencing fits beautifully with Filipino martial arts.
Yes, sir.
Especially as it applies to largo mano. Now you have to play around with the grip. I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to grab a training blade. Okay, I don't know how well you can see this.
Yep, I can see it.
There are so many ways to hold a blade. Like this is one of my favorite, the 3-finger method, because it's very strong, adds a lot of snap into snap cuts, and you have the ability to use your index finger and thumb for other things.
Makes sense.
But if I'm going to thrust, I vastly prefer this.
Yes.
Right? Because it's lined up with my skeleton. And when you thrust with this grip, I actually have a training device at my academy. It looks like an oak door made out of 2x10 oak planks that are just put into a frame. Yeah. So I can throw knives at it, or I can stab it with training knives. I can hit it with training weapons. I train with weapons a lot on things that are not just heavy bags, a lot. And one thing I learned is if you try to stab something solid with many traditional grips, that knife is going to slide right up your hand like this.
Yes, sir.
And so I took to the thrusting grip, and I can put all my body weight behind that and stick a knife a half inch into an oaken board and lean my body weight on it, and it supports it if I use the thrusting grip. I like that a lot. It's not the only way that I use a weapon to thrust with, but it's sort of my go-to power thrust structure, and it fits perfectly with the arm movements of fencing. The point, especially epee and foil, which are point only.
Yes.
So 20 years of fencing really gets you used to, okay, you're constrained by the fact that you're not allowed to cut, but you can thrust, right? You're not allowed to use your left hand, which always irritated me.
Yeah, I bet.
You're not allowed to use my fencing teacher used to smack me on the left arm because I was breaking the rules of fencing by curling my arm in like a boxing guard.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not allowed to do that because that covers legal target with illegal target. You're shielding yourself with illegal target.
Makes sense.
I agree it's kind of silly, but I wanted to learn fencing. So he had to teach me because my reflex was to keep my hands up from kickboxing, and he would just smack that left arm over and over again. And I finally learned to keep my left arm behind me.
Mm-hmm.
And so my constraint is I only can use my right hand and that weapon, and the other guy's doing the same thing. How do I poke him before he pokes me? And it's a fascinating sport, and there were times when I would rationalize and go, well, this is stupid because I could do this and this and this. But as I finally started to get better at it and understood it better, I don't know if you know anything about the right-of-way convention of fencing.
No.
There's a rule in fencing called right-of-way.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be there because when you and I are fencing with each other and you thrust at me and I thrust at you and we hit so close in time to each other that it seems like a tie to us,
mm-hmm.
there has to be a mechanism in fencing for deciding who earns that touch.
That makes
one
sense.
guy it can be called simultaneous or simultaneous
Mm-hmm.
and thrown out. But there's a right-of-way convention that says if I extend my arm in a threatening manner so that my body's lined up for a thrust and not just I'm standing here with the weapon in an on guard position with the point generally aimed in your direction. But if I lock out my elbow and I'm aiming a pistol and I point it right at your vital targets or whatever targets for epee or epee, everything's a target.
Mm-hmm.
There's no illegal target in epee. But whatever legal targets are, you threaten it. Then you step in from that position with your footwork and put the point on him. If he spastically jabs his point out at the same time and ties you, you win the touch because you threaten target area first. And that's to teach you not to run onto the point of a lethal weapon, just to score a point in a sport.
Yeah, that makes
okay. Does that
makes total sense? Thank you.
Yeah, it rewards being cautious about. I want the right of way. If you have the right of way, I can take it from you by parrying. Now your point's no longer threatening. By parrying and then extending my weapon in a threatening manner,
mm-hmm.
I just stole right of way from you, right? And so if then there's another tie, I was biting my. Interestingly, one might say upon hearing this, yeah, but how often do those simultaneous touches happen? They happen all the friggin' time.
I bet.
If we're doing a 5-touch bout with each other, it's probably going to happen at least 2 times just in a 5-touch bout. And you have these. If you don't have someone acting as an official, usually there's another guy in the class that gets drafted. You be the referee, and it's his job to award points, and then you get mad at him because you think you got it. But it's fascinating because it makes everybody become better at analyzing the exchange that just happened.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I started to realize that with a thrusting grip instead of a 3-finger grip,
mm-hmm.
I can do a full fencing lunge and stick my weapon into someone. And it's not going to bend my arm from the power of the thrust. Anyway, I don't know. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but I really like this grip.
That. And what I see as well is that you started off with the first grip with 3 fingers. And the reason it's an easy shift. That's an easy shift, right? To go into a different
I have a YouTube channel, by the way.
Yeah.
And I've got about 100.
Tell us about it.
It's just got my name, Jeff Westfall. I think there might be another channel with the same name. So if I recall correctly, the one that applies to me, you'll see a circle with a letter J in it, and the background of the circle is dark green. I think that's my logo on YouTube.
Okay.
But it's just under my name. I've got about 100 videos on there
mm-hmm.
covering the gamut of things. Well, when COVID hit and I had to close my academy,
mm-hmm.
I started jonesing to teach anybody.
Yeah.
And so I just took my phone out and put it on a tripod and just started making videos for whoever
mm-hmm.
and putting them out as free content. And that scratched my itch a little tiny bit. But the ones I get by far the most views and by far the most feedback on are a 3-part series I did on knife gripping.
Okay.
Going over the So if you want to see me go into much more detail about that, go to my YouTube channel and you can see what I'm talking about with these, and the transitions, from heaven to earth and so on. There's some really specific details I go into about how to do that, and a lot of people like that a lot. So anyway, so if you and I have a stick and we have fencing masks on and we're just going to play and we're going to spar, before I get into some broader range with you, or even play a lot of Largo games with you, I'm going to see if you know what to do with a point coming at you. And if you show me that you do, then we'll flow back and forth between point fencing and Largo Mano FMA style, which is saber fencing essentially, which I also did. And so then until you start getting to some broader range, and where that changes everything is, of course, now your left hand can come in. Once you get to some broader range, the fencing goes out. Except, old Italian and Spanish fencing did a lot of things that were very similar to the way certain people teach Filipino martial arts, especially Sombrada. It's obvious to me that the Europeans had used the check hand quite a bit.
Absolutely. As well as the other dagger in the other hand. So they
absolutely. Sword and dagger was ubiquitous as dueling weapons, not as military weapons, but certainly as dueling weapons. That brings up a whole other topic, and that is, in my integrated martial arts program, I divide my curriculum into 3 areas. One of those areas is, in my opinion, what almost everybody else teaches, which is dueling. Almost everything we're taught in the martial arts is one-on-one.
Absolutely.
And if you spar, it's not a surprise. It's not someone ambushing you. So I think that's an important skill set. You must be able to fight with the guy that says, let's step outside. And maybe you step outside, or maybe he waits for you outside and you go out. Okay, so it's an appointed upon place and time. It's not a surprise. I didn't want to be here, but this guy wants to fight with me and I can't get out of it. That's still a duel. A duel is anytime it's just 2 people, whether it's sport or self-defense, and there's no chance of anybody else jumping in. And so that's a very important skill set, but dueling will get you killed in a bar brawl. I'll give you an example. You don't mind if I go off on tangents like this, I'm assuming. I haven't been keeping track of time at all.
That's okay. We're going to try to wrap up in about 25 minutes, okay?
Okay. So anyway, it struck me that knowing what I know about ground and pound and MMA and street fighting, that's a terrible name for it. I hate street fighting as a name, but real confrontations, whether you're a bouncer or whatever it is, one of the best positions I can get into in a duel, MMA duel, is mounted on you.
Yes, absolutely.
I can pound your face in. I can get you to turn your back if that's what I want to do. I can be humane, which is my preference, but I'm protected. But if it's you and I are out having a good time at a club, and 2 other guys start a fight with us, and I get mounted on one of them, and I look over and I see that maybe you've fallen or something, and I'm looking up at your opponent who's standing while I'm on my knees, and he skull kicks me and takes me out. All my training was worthless because I took dueling to a melee.
Yes.
And Guro Inosanto touches on this stuff all the time. Absolutely. And we did some, and he's the only instructor I've ever had who has us work on 2-on-2 scenarios, like it's a football play, and unfair scenarios. I've got an opponent who weighs 260 pounds and I'm 67 years old and I have a stick. and I weigh 167 pounds. So that's realistic. We're careful when we do it, but that's part of integrated martial arts too. You also, when you duel, whether it's sparring in a ring, rolling on a mat, fencing on the strip, is you train for that environment. Absolutely. Meaning when you train in a ring, you get used to the ropes. You roll on a mat, you're used to being on a nice cushy surface that's unlikely to injure you. That's very important that we do that. I'm not saying don't do that.
I understand.
Right?
Exactly what you're saying, sir.
Yeah. If you're in a fight in a place where there's broken glass, you don't necessarily want to go to the ground. you want to know how to titrate your grappling knowledge, like John Danaher has the best self-defense instructional I've ever seen. And it's the product of 10 years of him being a bouncer in violent dive bars in New York City. And he shows how to do a high single leg on someone that's, mouthing off with you, and run them out the door or dump them on their back while you're still standing, so that you can then go to what he calls standing versus ground, which is awful stuff. But it's, there are scenarios you can envision. Now the same scenario, your opponent has knocked you down, and I've beaten my opponent. I look over and your opponent's mounted on you. I can now skull kick him and get him off of you. But that's all very different from the way most people practice martial arts. So that's the melee part of it. And another part I put into it is I call the chimp charge.
The chimp charge.
The chimp charge, yeah. And that is, what if my opponent does something profoundly stupid that I would never recommend one of my students to do, but he does it, like lower his head and come sprinting at me while I'm holding a sword. If that actually happens, like if I'm out in my garage, I've got weapons all along the walls in my garage, but it just looks from the outside like a garage, and some guy wants to come up my driveway, I'm picking up a sword or a spear, just as a deterrent, but yet I know how to use it as well. And if I have to use a sword on a big guy, I know how I'm going to do it, but that's not how we spar at the school.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And so it could be an unfair situation like that, or it could be I had a guy come to my door on Halloween during COVID with his kids with a live blade, double-bitted axe on his shoulder. Walk up to my front door like that. I said, "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step out to the street with the axe, please, not in front of my house." And he goes, "It's just a prop." I go, it's a lethal weapon, and I don't want you standing at my door here. My daughter's right here in the other room. I don't want you here. And I wasn't impolite about it, but I didn't like the guy standing with the axe on my porch. And I pictured, what if that had gone wrong? Now it's the other way around. So anyway, I got off the topic of the chimp charge. The chimp charge is a guy decides he wants to fight you from 25 feet away and just comes sprinting at you. You don't know if he's going to come in low and try to tackle you. An educated chimp charge would be a shot from a wrestler.
Yeah.
Right? He's committing and he's coming, and if you don't know how to deal with it, tough luck for you.
Absolutely.
If he's a C-lot guy, an educated chimp charge is coming in with the spear action, right? The forward lever. That's an educated chimp charge. You are driving your whole self through him, right? The uneducated chimp charge is just a drunk guy who just wants to come towards you. He has no concept of where he's going to stop. How do you deal with that guy? That's a different set of skills for self-defense. That combines a sprawl of wrestling with the spear of C-Lot and, Tony Blauer and all the other guys that do any kind of spearing action, and being ready for the guy to stop halfway to you. And, now the chimp charge has turned into a duel. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely.
Because we don't really duel chimp charges very much. We don't really duel this guy. Just pretend you're drunk and you hate me and you don't care about your own safety. What would you do? And we play games like that where we try to be careful, but it certainly throws your timing off for someone to just sprint at you in a dead run. So for me, one of the offshoots in the grand combat algorithm is the little sub-universe of the guy does something profoundly stupid and flings his anatomy at you, and if you hesitate, it can be bad for you. Yet we don't really spar that. So I divided it between the chimp charge, just for pure safety, for horrible situations. And then in the middle is sort of the gentlemanly art of dueling, if you will, whether it's, with weapons or without. And then there's, of course, the melee, which is kind of like a combination. I might be dueling with one guy in a melee, but I'm watching the surroundings because I don't know who these people around me are. I have a student who was a very good MMA fighter, a black belt in jiu-jitsu under me, very good. When he was a purple belt and a brown belt, he was regularly beating black belts in competition. And he has a side hustle as a DJ. And he was DJing at a local bar, and he saw a fight start. And normally he would stay behind his DJ table and just watch it with the educated eye of a fighter and either be entertained by it or whatever. He had the bouncers were there. He didn't feel like they weren't paying him to be a bouncer. But one night he saw a guy pick up a bottle, when a melee had already started. And he jumped over his table and grabbed the guy's wrist and goes, that ain't happening, and the guy turned around to fight him. And the next thing he knows, he's being hit in the face from 90 degrees to the left by that guy's buddy. Now, this is a guy that would totally kill either of those two guys, but he got stolen on because he had tunnel vision like any pure duelist would have, right? He was totally focused on his opponent, and this scrub almost knocked him out with a straight right hand to the chin. And he was talking to me on the phone about it. He goes, I can't believe that happened. I said, I've been talking to you for years that you need to learn how to open your eyes up to your 6 and your 3 and your 9 and your what's below you and what's above you in a self-defense situation. It's not the same as being in the cage. It's not the same as being in the ring. He goes, I believe you now. Because it was tunnel vision that only comes to a duelist.
Absolutely. And all of that happens in the moment, which is the truth,
which is the truth. You're exactly right. No matter what form you want it to take, the truth will come out.
Yeah. And then in the moment at that time, absolutely, sir. I appreciate you so much stopping in and doing this with me. And I have enjoyed catching up with you tremendously.
Well, thank you. That's kind of you.
Well, you've always been kind to me, and Michael Harrell speaks so highly of you as well. And
but he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Oh, I bet he does.
Mike Harrell has the most cutting wit of any human I've met before or since.
Yes, he does. Without a
doubt. He may have mellowed. I don't know if he mellowed in his old age. I suspect he probably has, maybe slightly, but not much. But I can remember like someone insulting him and just closing my eyes and turning my head and going, "Don't make eye contact.
Yes.
Don't look. It's going to be bad."
Well, yeah, he's much more gentle now. You know what I mean? But it's still funnier than hell. And
yes,
the cunning,
very funny man.
Absolutely. Guro, one thing that I didn't prepare you for, and I'm sorry, but can I ask? Is there something you would recommend to our viewers that they do in the next 24 hours? Because we're always looking for changes or different things. And, Michael.
You mean in reference to martial arts?
In reference to martial arts, or you could say whatever it is that you wanted to say. Michael Harrell had said to me that don't just look for an opportunity tomorrow in the next 24 hours, finding an opportunity throughout the day to make myself
okay, I've got you
in something.
I've got you. The way I express that is, you may or may not have, I don't know if you mind if I reveal this, but as I told you the other day on the phone, I'm fighting cancer right now.
I know.
And, I'm doing okay, mostly okay. My radiation oncologist, I said, no one will tell me my odds. What are my odds of survival? He said about 80%. So I still have no symptoms of cancer, even though it's stage 3, it's not operable. That sounds awful. It's treatable with radiation and hormone therapy and chemotherapy. I'm currently on a hiatus from chemotherapy because I had a really bad reaction to it. But I'm going to start that back up next month. The chemotherapy is not what you think. I'm not sitting with an infusion bag in my arm. It's just pills. But anyway, I've felt this for a long time, but it's really become true for me here recently. And that is, I just get up every day. I go, I got a pulse. I can walk. I can teach a class. I'm going to squeeze all the juice out of today. And then tomorrow, I'll get up and make the same assessment. I'll do inventory. Does all the shit work? Okay. If it still works, if the brain seems to work, I'll show up at the academy and teach again. Teaching has been my rock throughout all of this cancer treatment. I start to feel, low, get in a dark place. I go teach a class. Boom. I instantly feel better. It's wonderful. And my students have been fantastic through this time. But that's basically like what Mike said. I don't think there's anything wrong with spending healthy goofing off time. I think that's self-treatment. But also, you absolutely have got to look for opportunities. When an opportunity presents itself, you don't want to wait to be ready for it. You want to be ready for it when it does. And that opportunity might be spend a little time finding some online instruction in some art that you want to know more about. Looking at the YouTube channel of your instructor, and watching videos you've seen before, but look for extra details. Whatever it is, whether it's working out or whatever, do it like it's the last time you're ever going to get to do it. And it really does make a difference. That's where I'd probably leave that.
Thank you, Guro. I appreciate you so much.
My pleasure. I appreciate you having me on.
It has been wonderful. This is Jamie Sparling for the FormABLE Podcast, and I am the owner and head instructor of Affinity Martial Arts in Wausau, Wisconsin. And we are speaking with Guro Jeff Westfall, who is the owner and head instructor of Rising Phoenix Martial Arts in Evansville, Indiana, and my senior in the Inosanto system. Thank you, Guro. I appreciate you being here. And you're going to come back.
You were a very kind host. Thank you.
Thank you. You're going to come back and see us again, hey?
Absolutely. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, you notice the hey at the end. The Wisconsin got to me. I originally was Illinois. I spent time.
Well, I got cousins from Minnesota, so.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, you're going to come back and see us again, and I'm going to ask you more about your integrated martial arts.
Awesome.
Okay. God bless you.
Take care, buddy.
Be in touch. Thank you.
Bye-bye.